she was just the wrench girl. Not a pilot, someone had sneered once as Ava Lockhart knelt beside the Chinook rotor, tightening the last bolt. She was covered in grease, her hands stained and rough from years of labor, and yet she said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes, louder than any words could. It was her way, a quiet defiance, a self-imposed vow to be more than the sum of her parts, even if the world refused to see her that way. But when the evac chopper went down, mid-mission, and no one was left who could fly, it was Ava who did what no one expected. Without hesitation, she grabbed a spare key, slammed the cockpit shut, and flew straight into a storm of enemy fire. There was no question in her mind, no second-guessing. The wrench girl became the one who brought home 7 soldiers and a folded flag. Out did a mechanic who spent her days tightening bolts and making sure helicopters stayed airborne, become the one who saved them all. Who had trained her, and how did she have the skill to do something that seemed impossible? Ava Lockhart was 31 years old, and she was haunted by the sound of rotors, the hum of metal, the churning rhythm of blades slicing through the air. She was haunted by what had been and what she had lost. At Forward Operating Base Outpost Theta, situated on the razor's edge between Iraq and nowhere, she worked alone in the maintenance hangar. It was her sanctuary, her domain. The hum of machinery was her only constant. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense bun, and her coveralls were stained with hydraulic fluid marks of years spent in isolation. Years spent inside machines, far from the heart of what she had once loved. Around her left wrist, she wore a length of frayed parachute cord. It was blackened with age and oil, an artifact of her past. Attached to the cord was a small piece of worn metal, unrecognizable to anyone who didn't know its significance. It was a fragment from the cyclic control of a UH-60 Black Hawk that had crashed 7 years ago, with her best friend Ryan Delmote still at the controls. The memory of that day, of that moment, haunted Ava like a shadow that never quite let her go. Ava had been the star of her flight class at Fort Rucker. She and Ryan had been the golden pair, 2 kids from nowhere who flew like they'd been born with wings. They were naturals, instructors said. Lucky, said the other students. To each other, they were family. The only family either of them had left. The crash happened during a low-level training exercise. Engine failure at 60 feet. Auto rotation impossible. Ground coming up fast. Ryan had done everything he could, held the tail steady until the last second, giving Ava the angle she needed to survive the impact. He died on contact. She walked away with 3 broken ribs and a psychological trauma that ended her flying career before it even had a chance to take flight. The diagnosis was pilot-induced anxiety disorder, written by the flight surgeon. Recommend permanent grounding. Psychological evaluation, the report had said. Ava had chosen a different path. She chose maintenance. Someone had to keep these machines safe. Someone who understood what happened when they failed. At Outpost Theta, Ava worked in deliberate isolation. She didn't drink with the pilots, didn't join their stories about close calls or heroic saves. She kept to herself, and when the other pilots looked her way, it was always with that same dismissive air. They thought of her as just the wrench girl, the one who made sure their machines didn't fall apart. But that was fine with her. She wore headphones constantly, not for music, but to avoid conversations that might require her to explain why. A qualified pilot spent her days with wrenches instead of flight controls. Her corner of the hangar was a world unto itself. Hand-drawn schematics of every aircraft on base were pinned to the walls. Maintenance schedules, stress analysis charts. A universe of mechanical knowledge. It was a world that kept everyone else airborne while she remained grounded. One morning, as the sun began to rise over the harsh desert landscape, casting long shadows across the base, Ava Lockhart worked diligently in the maintenance hangar, adjusting the rotor head on Chinook 217. The familiar hum of machinery and the sharp scent of oil filled the air, a constant in her life, an ever-present reminder of the world she belonged to, the world of bolts and gears, metal and grease. Her hands moved expertly, the practiced motions of a mechanic who had spent years in isolation, far removed from the chaos and unpredictability of the skies. Yet, despite the familiarity, the work was never routine. Each aircraft, every system, was an opportunity to ensure the safety of the soldiers who relied on these machines for survival. The hangar was quiet, save for the occasional clink of tools and the rhythmic sound of Ava's steady breathing as she tightened bolts and adjusted the rotor. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, sweat beading on her forehead from the heat. That began to intensify with the rising sun. She was a master of this world, the world of maintenance, but in the larger world of flight operations, she was often overlooked, reduced to nothing more than the wrench girl. The pilots passed by without acknowledging her, their conversations never reaching her ears, her presence little more than a shadow in the background. But today, something felt different. Ava could sense it in the air, an unease, an undercurrent of tension, as though the base itself was holding its breath. The soldiers moved more quickly, their boots thudding against the concrete floor, the sound of their footsteps breaking the otherwise serene silence. It wasn't long before a group of medical evacuation team members walked past the hangar. There, faces set with the stern expressions of those who had seen the worst of the world. They were talking amongst themselves, laughing and joking, as soldiers often did when they were trying to push down the weight of the stress and trauma that followed them wherever they went. But then, one voice rose above the others, a young sergeant with a smirk on his face, clearly unaware of the quiet storm brewing inside Ava. "She probably thinks she can fly it better than us," he sneered, his words dripping with condescension, as though the very thought of a mechanic even considering piloting a Chinook was laughable. His comrades chuckled, a few even exchanging knowing glances, but Ava didn't look up. She didn't need to. She'd heard this all before. The sergeant's words stung more than she cared to admit, a sharp reminder of the place she held in the eyes of those around her. She was the wrench girl, the one who fixed the machines but never flew them. She was the one who kept everything running smoothly, making sure the aircraft stayed airborne, but never the one who got to soar. Never the one who was seen as the hero. And yet, that didn't matter. She had made peace with that long ago. She was the unseen force that kept it all together. The hands that worked tirelessly in the background while others took the credit. She wasn't looking for recognition. She wasn't looking for approval. But sometimes, just sometimes, she couldn't help but feel the sting of being invisible. Ava's grip tightened on the wrench she held, her knuckles whitening as she continued to adjust the rotor head, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. She said nothing. She never did. There was no need to engage. She didn't have to prove anything to anyone. The work spoke for itself. The Chinook 217, the very bird they so casually mocked, had been maintained and repaired by her hands. Every nut, every bolt, every rotor blade had been checked, recalibrated, and meticulously ensured to be in perfect working order. She had saved countless lives without anyone ever knowing the depth of her expertise, the hours of dedication that had gone into keeping these machines in the sky. She didn't need to answer the sergeant or the other pilots. She knew the truth. The machines knew the truth. But as the group of evac team members walked further down the hangar, Ava couldn't help but feel the bitterness creep up inside her. It wasn't about the words they had spoken. It was about the unspoken truth beneath them, that a woman, a mechanic, could never be as valuable as a pilot. That in the hierarchy of their world, she would always be second to the men who flew, regardless of how much she knew or how hard she worked. Still, Ava pushed those thoughts aside. She had learned long ago not to let the opinions of others define her. Her value was not dependent on the recognition of those around her. She didn't need to prove herself, not to the pilots, not to the officers, not to anyone. Her value was in the precision with which she worked, the unwavering focus with which she kept these machines functioning. She was the one who ensured that they would never fail, the one who kept the engines running, the rotors spinning, soldiers safe. As the sounds of the evac team's laughter faded into the distance, Ava's mind returned to the task at hand. She was here, in this hangar, for a reason. She was here because she understood what it meant to keep something alive. She understood the machines better than anyone else because she had spent years learning their secrets. She had spent years breaking them down, understanding their weaknesses, and finding ways to make them stronger. She didn't need to fly them to know their worth. She knew them better than anyone. Ava took a deep breath, pushing the lingering bitterness away. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was here to make sure the job got done. No matter what anyone thought of her, no matter what anyone said, she would do what she was meant to do. She would fix the machines. She would keep them running. And if the time ever came when they needed to fly, she would be ready. And so, she tightened the last bolt with precision, making sure it was secure, making sure the Chinook 217 was ready for its next mission. The work was simple, but it was important. Every detail mattered. Every part was critical. The work never stopped. Not for her, not for anyone, because Ava Lockhart, the wrench girl, was the one who made sure the machines never failed. Probably, another added, but I'd feel safer with a monkey on the stick than her. Ava said nothing. She simply tightened bolt. No, 14, the same bolt. That had failed in Ryan's aircraft 7 years ago. It was the bolt she checked obsessively, every time, on every helicopter that passed through her hands. She had to make sure it would never fail again. She couldn't bear to think of it. That was her way. Always vigilant. Always calculating. Later that evening, she sat alone before an old flight simulator in the back of the hangar. The equipment was outdated, patched with spare parts, but still functional. One hand rested on the simulated cyclic control, the other resting on the small piece of metal on her wrist. Beneath her oil-stained sleeve was a faded tattoo, barely visible now. It read, "I learn. I watch. I fly when no one can." September 15th. 30 hours later, Alpha Team Chinook lifted off into the pale desert dawn, carrying 7 soldiers home from a 2-week patrol in the Delta sector. It should have been a routine extraction, a routine flight path, nothing that could have gone wrong. But 47 minutes into the flight, disaster struck. The radio crackled to life, its transmission drowned by static. "Base, this is Alpha 9. We're hit, losing altitude fast." The transmission was cut off. Ava's wrench froze in her hand. The command center erupted into chaos. Officers shouted coordinates. Radio operators scrambled to re-establish contact. Maps were pulled out, rescue options calculated and discarded. The nearest rescue aircraft was 200 kilometers away, with a response time of at least 90 minutes. In combat zones, 90 minutes might as well have been an eternity. Ava stood at the door of the maintenance hangar, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the spare key in her pocket. She approached the tactical operations officer. "What's the wind pattern above Foxtrot Ridge?" Lieutenant Colonel Hayes gave her a look of disbelief. "Why the hell do you care, mechanic?" Ava didn't answer. She didn't need to. In her head, she was already calculating wind speed at altitude, fuel consumption for a round trip to the crash coordinates, landing approaches in hostile territory with potentially damaged equipment. The same calculations she had done 1,000 times in her head, but never had reason to use. She turned and walked toward Chinook 217. No one stopped her. Why would they? She was just a wrench girl, probably going to prep the bird for when real pilot showed up. But Ava wasn't prepping anything. She climbed into the cockpit, movements fluid and practiced. Her hands found the switches and controls with muscle memory that shouldn't have existed anymore. She bypassed the normal startup sequence, activating auxiliary power first, a trick she'd learned by watching pilots prepare for emergency launches. The engine spooled up with a whine that drew attention from across the base. Through the windscreen, she saw officers running toward the aircraft, shouting and waving their arms. Too late. Ava pulled the collective, and Chinook 217 lifted into the desert sky without authorization, without a flight plan, without permission from anyone except her own conscience. The radio exploded with voices. Unauthorized aircraft, return to base immediately. Ava switched to emergency frequency and transmitted her first words as an unofficial pilot. Alpha 9, this is maintenance. I'm coming to get you. The response came through heavy static. Maintenance? Who the hell is maintenance? Someone who knows every bolt in this bird, Ava replied, banking northeast toward the crash site. Hold on, I'm 40 minutes out. Below her, the desert stretched like a brown ocean, dotted with villages and potential hostile positions. Somewhere beyond the horizon, 7 soldiers waited for rescue that wasn't supposed to come from someone like her, a woman who wasn't supposed to know how to fly. But sometimes, the impossible was just the improbable waiting for the right moment. Ava pushed the Chinook's engines to maximum sustainable power and flew toward a destiny she had never imagined but had been preparing for her entire career. 38 minutes into unauthorized flight, she spotted the wreckage. Alpha 9 Chinook lay broken against a rocky outcrop. One rotor blade snapped, smoke rising from the engine compartment. The aircraft had pancaked into the valley floor. Its tail boom twisted at an unnatural angle. But there were figures moving around the wreckage. Survivors. Ava circled once, assessing the landing zone. The terrain was wrong for a standard approach. Too narrow, too rocky, power lines crossing one end, a steep embankment on the other. But Ava wasn't flying by the manual anymore. She remembered something Sarah Martinez had shown her during night training, a steep approach technique using the terrain itself as a brake. It was dangerous, unorthodox, never attempted in combat conditions. Perfect for a situation where standard procedures meant leaving people behind. Ava dropped the Chinook's nose and dove toward the valley floor at a 28-degree angle, bleeding speed through aggressive collective inputs and rotor wash deflection off the rock walls. The aircraft shuddered beneath Ava's hands, the sharp vibrations reverberating through her fingertips as she pushed it beyond its normal operating parameters. It was a feeling she had come to know intimately, the subtle tremors of the Chinook, the way the metal frame groaned under pressure, the way it fought to hold together as she tested its limits. Ava's breath was steady, her focus unbroken. Every nerve in her body was attuned to the aircraft, to the delicate balance between pushing it too far and keeping it intact. But she had been here before. She had done this 1,000 times in her head, in the isolation of the maintenance hangar, where the hours blurred together, and every part of the machine was a part of her own understanding. Her hands moved instinctively, each motion fluid and precise, adjusting the cyclic and collective controls with an expertise that came from years of working with these machines, from years of learning the intricacies of the airframe. The engines howled in protest, the sound of the turbines spinning up to full power, the rhythmic pulse of the rotor blades cutting through the air with a force that threatened to rip the airframe apart. But Ava didn't flinch. She knew this aircraft. She knew it better than anyone else on the base. She knew its strengths and its weaknesses. She knew exactly how much stress it could handle before it began to break. Every rivet in the airframe, every bolt, every weld Ava had learned to read them like an open book. She had spent years in the maintenance hangar, her eyes constantly scanning for wear and tear, for weaknesses that could lead to failure. She knew how much torque each part could handle, how far she could push the engines before they would begin to falter. She knew the exact point where the airframe would begin to protest, to groan under the strain. But it wasn't just the technical specifications that she relied on. It was the feel of the machine, the subtle shifts in vibration, the way the controls responded to her touch. She could feel every stress point in the aircraft's body. She could tell by the faintest change in the hum of the engine when it was nearing its limit. And she knew how to coax it just a little bit further, to push it past what was supposed to be possible, to make it do what it was never designed to do. As the Chinook flew lower, the turbulence increasing with every second, Ava's mind was sharp, calculating every move, every decision. The airframe shuddered again, and she felt it in her bones, the familiar, unsettling vibration that came with pushing the aircraft to its edge. But she wasn't worried. She had done this before. She had flown these birds under the most extreme conditions, had pushed them harder than any of the pilots would dare. She had learned the limits of their design, had memorized every critical stress point, every weakness in the structure. It wasn't just mechanical knowledge that guided her actions. It was an instinct, a deep understanding of the machine's soul. A connection that had formed over years of working with these aircraft, of repairing and maintaining them, of watching them go from damaged wrecks to fully functional machines again. Each time she worked on an aircraft, she became more attuned to it, more connected to its structure, its purpose. She understood how the airframe responded to different conditions, how it adapted under stress, how it could survive the impossible if it was given the right care and attention. And now, as she flew this bird through enemy fire, as she pushed the limits of its design, she knew exactly how far she could take it. She knew how much pressure it could handle before the airframe would begin to fail. She could feel the metal groaning beneath her, the engine straining to keep up, but she knew it wasn't time to pull back yet. Not yet. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time, a deeper vibration that sent a thrill of adrenaline coursing through Ava's veins. She felt the strain in her hands, in her feet, as she adjusted the controls, compensating for the changes in the aircraft's behavior. The rotors began to sound different, faster, higher-pitched, and Ava's instincts kicked in. She adjusted the throttle, tweaking the collective just enough to keep the bird from spiraling into a stall. She could feel the tension in the airframe, the resistance in the controls, but she was in control. She always had been. Ava had never been one to shy away from danger. She had always been the one who would push the limits, who would test the boundaries of what was possible. It wasn't arrogance that drove her. It was the deep, unshakable knowledge that she understood this machine in a way that no one else could. While others might hesitate, might worry about the risks, Ava had learned long ago that the difference between success and failure wasn't just about skill, it was about trust. Trust in the machine, trust in herself, trust that she knew exactly how much stress it could handle before it would break. And in this moment, as the Chinook shuddered beneath her hands, as the desert stretched out below her like an endless sea of dust and danger, Ava knew she wasn't going to let it break. Not today. Not while she was in control. Her hands moved with the ease of someone who had spent countless hours in the cockpit, who had flown countless hours in the air, pushing the aircraft to its limits. She didn't need to glance at the instruments anymore. She could feel it in her bones when something was off, when something was wrong. The way the aircraft responded to her commands, the subtle shifts in the vibrations, it all told her everything she needed to know. She didn't need a checklist. She didn't need the manuals. She had internalized them all. This was the moment where the impossible became possible, where the machine was pushed beyond its design to do something that shouldn't have been possible. The Chinook shuddered again, and Ava's grip tightened, her muscles straining as she kept the aircraft in check. She had pushed it further than anyone would have dared, but she wasn't done yet. Not yet. She could feel the airframe beginning to groan, the pressure building as she pushed the engines harder, demanding more power. The vibrations were louder now, almost deafening, but she didn't back off. She couldn't. The soldiers were counting on her. The mission was counting on her. And Ava Lockhart would never let them down. She knew every rivet in the airframe. Every single one. She knew the exact amount of stress each one could handle, the precise point at which the machine would begin to give. And right now, as the Chinook fought against the forces threatening to tear it apart, she knew it wasn't time to stop. Not yet. She adjusted the controls again, coaxing the aircraft higher, her focus unwavering. She knew the risks, knew the dangers. But she also knew that if she could just get them through this, if she could just keep the bird intact for a little longer, they would make it. She would make it. The Chinook shuddered once more, but this time the vibration was different. It wasn't just the airframe protesting. It was the wind, the force of the enemy fire, the pressure of the mission. But Ava knew what she had to do. She could feel the machine's strength, feel the limits stretching just a little further. She had pushed it to the edge, but she wasn't going to let it break. Not today. With one final adjustment, Ava felt the aircraft stabilize beneath her. The vibrations lessened, the groaning of the metal fading into the background as the Chinook responded to her commands. She had done it. She had pushed it beyond normal operating parameters, but she had known exactly how far she could go. She had trusted the machine, trusted herself, and now they were both still airborne, still flying. And as the Chinook continued its flight toward the mission's objective, Ava Lockhart smiled faintly, knowing that no matter what came next, she had once again proven that she understood this machine better than anyone else. That she knew exactly how much stress it could handle, and that sometimes that was enough to get the job done. She touched down hard, but controlled, absorbing the impact with groans of protest. Through the dust kicked up by her rotors, she saw the survivors clearly, now 7 figures, one lying motionless on a makeshift stretcher. Sergeant Rodriguez waved frantically. Ava kept the engines running, sprinted from the cockpit to the rear cargo door. No time for proper shutdown procedures. No time for anything except loading casualties and getting airborne before enemy forces arrived to investigate the crash. "Who the hell are you?" Rodriguez shouted over the rotor noise. "I'm your ride home," Ava replied, helping drag the wounded soldier toward her aircraft.